a long passage. I tend to choose long passages, which is maybe not wise. Might lose your attention in the middle of the reading. Let's hope not. Well, we have a Mongolian message this morning. We're going to hopefully understand a little bit more of what we say when we say that God is Father. That's what I hope, at least. When we study the Creed, what we're studying is not simply something that is a set of doctrine. It is a set of doctrine. It is a set, sort of a summary, if you will, of what it is that Christians believe. You know, that's normal. And any religion has that. So this is not unique to Christianity, right? Any religion has a set of beliefs that it holds to be true, and it also has a set of beliefs that it does not hold to be true, right? So Christianity is not unique. So if the Creed is simply a statement of doctrine, then that in and of itself would not make Christianity something unique. What makes Christianity unique and what makes the Creed unique is the content, right? And that may sound a little bit obvious, but again, I want to make sure that we separate in our minds the recitation of the Creed, which is a religious ritual, from the content of the Creed, which is salvific content. Really, the Creed has a lot of power in it spiritually. So that's what we're trying to focus on in these few weeks when we're studying the Creed. Okay? Well, looky there, we have it. It's there, ready to go. What do we mean when we say Father, right? What do we mean when we say Father? For some of us, I think that the image of Father may not be so helpful, right? We're living in a sinful world where sometimes fathers are not helpful. That's reality, unfortunately, right? Sometimes I had a friend of mine back in the U.S. when I was, he was struggling to try to find out who God is, and I just mentioned one day, I said, well, God is your Father. And he's like, oh, that's even worse. That's even worse. And, finding out why he said that, I realized, well, he had a bad father. He really did. So, in this world, it's not working. It started working and then stopped working. Is that not like that? Okay.
How do I hit my button?
I'm pushing the next button.
Yeah, right.
Oh, yeah. What? Did I do that? Right, so, okay. Okay, now I'm working. Yeah. Okay, see, there's an image of a bad father, right? Classic bad father, right? There he is about to hit his son's fingers, right? I felt like a bad father this morning. I sort of mowed my son down and he scraped his knee again. He was already scraped, but I reopened the wound because I wasn't careful. I didn't see where he was, right? Sometimes fathers do things that hurt us. This is funny, but the fact is sometimes what fathers do is not funny, So when we say that God is our Father, I want you to try your best to imagine what a perfect father is, right? Because sometimes if we think about our own father, then we may be off track. We may be thrown off track. So, good fathers discipline out of love, and that's here in verse 6. And actually, verse 5 and 6 are taken from Proverbs chapter 3. It's a quotation the author of Hebrew puts in from Proverbs. And so it would be familiar to anybody who is a Hebrew, who might be reading the book of Hebrews, right? So it's a familiar passage, right? And the passage even says that if a father does not discipline, he insults the child. The ultimate insult is to be illegitimate, right? That means you have no parentage, you have no family, right? So if a father does not discipline the child, what it means is the father is rejecting the child and saying the child is not my own, right? That's a pretty strong statement. So when we think about fatherhood, a lot of times we think about discipline. And in fact, this passage, along with the Proverbs passage, and along with Luke chapter, I think 14, where we have the prodigal son passage, these are kind of the most famous passages in the scripture that we go to when we want to understand God as the Father, right? And a lot of theologians say, that this loving father heart of God is one of the most important attributes of God. That's one of the reasons it comes so early in the creed. I believe in God, the Father. Right? It's part of the first phrase that we put in the creed. And then also good discipline. There we go. Good discipline breeds respect, righteousness, and peace. Right? That's the message here in chapter 11. So read that passage. It's great. Verses 4 through 11. It's a wonderful passage. It talks about discipline of God. I think a lot of people have talked about that, right? So I'm not going to focus on that aspect of God. That's a very important part of what is meant when we say that God is Father. But here's a problem for us. What do we find ourselves living in? We find ourselves living in a difficult situation, right? It's one thing to see that a father disciplines us out of love and makes us suffer. But it's another thing to see that we already suffer enough, right? Right? We do suffer from the punishment of our parents. We do suffer from the chastisement of God, right? But that's one side of reality, right? The other side of reality is we already have a lot of problems. Is there something that fatherhood gives us that can help us with that? That's the question. And in the scripture here in Hebrews chapter 12, it says that difficulty and suffering may be a sign of the Father's love. But why do we struggle against sin? Ever think about that? If God is our Father, and if God is all-powerful, why did He give sin to us? Right? That doesn't make sense, does it? Why would God provide a situation for us where He says, you'd go be sinless, and then provide a sinful world for us to live in? Right? Is that really what a good father does? Provide that kind of situation for you? So, because then the scripture says, you must struggle against sin, right? Because God is watching. God the Father is watching. The lawgiver, right? He's there watching you. So you struggle against sin, right? And then also, verse 4 says, sometimes you don't struggle enough, right? Have you struggled to the point of blood, right? The question, have you bled in your fight against sin? Maybe not. But the big question here, lingering in my head when I read this passage is, if we are so sinful and poor, is having a good father really enough? Is that enough? Right? Because I know that in this present world, we all know fathers who have a great deal of love or a great deal of respect for their children, great deal of care for their children, and still, because their father is somehow limited, those fathers cannot provide what they wish for their children. We know this, right? I feel that sometimes with my own son, I want my son to have everything. I want him to have a wonderful life. I want him to have a wonderful attitude. I want to have good relationships with people around him. But guess who stands in the way? Me, right? This comes through, I'm not just thinking financially. We always think financially, right? So I provide what I can for my son. God provides the rest. He provides everything. But I'm talking about more important things, like impatience, right? Banzuki is not a terribly patient kid. And the reason why is because of me, right? He's learned that. He's learned that by watching Dad for almost 2.5 years, right? So that's the problem. Like, is having a good father really good enough? Because sometimes can we trust the character of this father is the question. Can we really trust the character of this father? And this passage says yes, right? We can't look to ourselves if we want to understand this father. Because if I look as a father look to myself, I see problems, right? And I know that, at least I trust that God doesn't have the same problems I have. I'm pretty sure that He doesn't, right? If I look to some other human example as a father, then again, I'm not really going to understand who God is. Does that make sense? Because humans are not the good example. Christ is the example of father, right? So we want to look at, what do we want to look at? We want to look at the father heart of God, right? We want to look at the heart of this father. And I think this passage is really interesting. You have this famous Hebrews 12, verse 4 through 13, the famous passage where, if a father loves his child, he'll discipline. That's famous. And then right before that, we have Hebrews chapter 11, which is the famous faith chapter. What is faith? And we talked about faith last week when we talked about belief, right? What is faith? Faith is, Hebrews says, the substance of something hoped for, the evidence of something not seen. Faith is believing in something that you have not seen. And then you have examples, right? And you get examples like, by faith, Rahab was able to escape with her life when the walls of Jericho came tumbling down. By faith, Moses led the children out of Egypt. By faith, Abraham took his family out of Ur and into another land. And by faith, you have all of these famous examples of what happens when you believe in this God. What happens if you trust and give your life to this God? That's the question that Hebrews chapter 11 answers. And then you have this really interesting passage, Hebrews 12, chapter 1 through 3, where it says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, what?" We have these examples, so what? What are we going to do? And I think those 3 verses there explain the father heart of God. And then verses 4 through 11, those verses are used to sort of add information. So that famous passage actually is kind of a footnote. Oh, is this going through without my knowledge? What happened there? Okay, I don't know. This started playing with things. All right. Where are we? Yeah, so we have the famous passage, okay? So verses 4 through 13 is the famous passage, but I think the famous passage is kind of a footnote. Do you know what a footnote is? It's an explanatory passage. I mean, it does other things, but this is one of the things it does. It explains verses 1 through 3. So I'm going to look at the scripture now, and let's read verses 1 through 3 together, just those verses, okay? Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." Consider him so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. What are we talking about in this passage? It's a famous, again, this passage itself is also famous. We love it. I think it's the father heart of God, one of the things that it is. A father tells us what in this passage? The first thing we see in verse 1 and 2, but the beginning of verse 2, is that a father tells us what is right and wrong and sets our eye on the proper goal. Is that there? Not sure what's going on. It was working so beautifully, and now it's not working anymore. Oh. Okay. Let's hope. I'm not going to touch anything. I'm going to only push the button that I need. Okay, there we go. A father tells us what is right and wrong and sets our eye on the proper goal. This is in verse 1 and 2. Therefore, since we are surrounded, so we have these examples, right? We have these examples. Now, what do we do with that? Right? Do we look at those people Do we look at those examples of faith? Maybe. And in some traditions, that's good. And in some way, that's good to look to somebody who has faith, right? But this passage says very clearly, right? So, let us fix our eyes on what? Jesus, right? The Son of God. If we have these examples, and if we know what is right and wrong, and if we know what faith is, then let us focus our eyes on Jesus, because that's where we know we won't go wrong, right? So the Father sets our eyes on the proper goal, and the proper goal here is noted to be the life of Jesus, right? We're supposed to live a life like Jesus. That's our goal. If we call ourselves Father, or if we call ourselves children of the Father, and if we call ourselves the people who say, I believe in God the Father, then our goal is to be like Jesus, right? Christ came as here we go. A father, look at this, a father uses his strength to reach the goal when we are unable to do it alone. Look in verse 2. It says, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and then sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Right? We know that we don't have this kind of power. When Jesus went to the garden to pray, what happened? He was praying so hard that he sweat blood. And what happened to the disciples? They were sleeping, right? We know this. The passage just assumes that we know this, right? But Jesus endured. That's the message. Jesus endured because of the strength that the Father gave him, right? And that's the message here. That Jesus was not only the person who founded our faith, but he finished our faith, right? He set our eyes on the proper goal, and when we had no power, because of our sinful condition, when we had no power to reach that goal of being like Christ on our own, Christ did it for us, right? That's the Father, right? What would you not do for your child? If your child needs something and they can't do it themselves, of course, that's what a father does. Says, okay, I'll do it for you. And that's what happened when Jesus died on the cross. God said, I want these people to be righteous and holy. They can't do it, so I'm going to do it for them. That's the heart of the Father. Now, the next important thing here is to notice in verse 3 that not only does the Father do the task for us, he also doesn't ignore us during the task, right? He encourages us while we're working in verse 3. Right? Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart, right? Yeah. Am I getting off track? No, I'm not. I'm still on track. Next. All right. So what about this showing us the path thing, right? The Father gives the law, but he also gives us an example. Christ came as the perfect Son. Here we go. Christ came as the perfect Son. If you want to know how to be a hyoja, if you want to know how to be a perfect Son, you can't hardly see that. The font changed on me. Look to him, verse 2, right? Let us fix our... And look what happened in verse 2. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and then what? Sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And then in Ephesians it says, God, that Jesus sits at the right hand of God, and God has given him all power and authority on earth. Why? This Father, this loving Father, has seen that his Son is good. He's seen the perfection of his Son, and then he lauds him with honor and praise, right? That's what the Father does. Christ suffered the pain of the world, and now he sits beside the Father in a place of honor. That's what the Father does, right? If you can give honor to your child, you do that, right? You do that. I think any father would like to see their children be children of honor, and like to have their children in a place of honor. So of course, the Father looked down upon his Son, who sacrificed his life for the world, and he sacrificed and he poured out his blood, and he said, all right, you are something worthy of all honor in the universe. So there you go. The Father shows us the pathway to be good. He shows us the pathway to be righteous. He puts our eyes on the proper goal, and where our eyes need to be is on His Son, Jesus Christ.